we have with us today Dr. Andrew Kayed, who is an Egyptian-Canadian art historian interested in the Middle East and contemporary art, queer theory, identity politics, migration, diaspora studies. We also have Jamil Hilu, who is one of the artists in this show, phenomenal artist. His work focuses on themes of identity, representation, cultural heritage, addressing intersections between race, gender, and sexuality. And then we have artist Lara Nassar, who's a multidisciplinary artist from Lebanon, who finished her MFA from Pratt Institute. And I specifically left the introductions kind of brief because I'm going to ask each one of you to kind of like give your version of introduction of who you are, and a little bit of a background about the art show. This panel is part of the art show Queering the Arab, in which it explores the meaning or how do we combine queerness and Arab identity at the same time in the setting of art, which are three words that are difficult to combine. The show's been up for about 6 weeks, and it features some of the work of Jamil Hilu. And interestingly enough, Jamil and Andrew have interacted before, but this is the first time they meet in person. Andrew, part of his dissertation, wrote about Jamil's work. And so this is a wonderful reunion of multiple different people. So to start off, I was going to ask each of you to give you a little bit of an introduction about yourself and answer the question of how do you identify as you introduced us to who you are.
Who would you like to go first?
Leave it up to you guys. Any of you, Andrew, would you like to start?
Sure. So thank you for the introduction, and thank you for bringing us all together. I'm really grateful for this afternoon that we can spend together. As you said, I finished my PhD, and currently I am the visiting global scholar at NYU Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality. And in my research, I focus on the artistic practices of the queer diaspora, and really trying to build connections and bridges with the current experiences of the queer Arab diaspora with historical moments in time in the Middle East, around the Arab world, where gender and sexuality changed, often due to imperialism or colonialism or different types of historical moments in time. So linking these histories to the current queer diaspora is a large part of my research.
Laura.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lara. I like to go by Lars to friends. I'm as you said, a multidisciplinary artist from Lebanon, and my work is largely centered around navigating chaos within makeshift structures. So living between the US and Lebanon, I've noticed very different mechanisms of coping as a being, as a sexual being, as a social being, who are by nature fluid and chaotic, and trying to sort of fit that into some kind of matrix within which we can be controlled and managed as a society. And more and more that's taken a turn towards addressing sexuality and gender, as far as seeking a structure or a way of being within an identity that is truly fluid and chaotic in nature. And it's really lovely to meet all of you digitally. I met Ali yesterday in person, but thanks for putting this together.
Hi, hello from Oakland, California. I'm Jamil Hilu. I'm a visual artist centered in the conversation of sexuality and my own personal history of understanding my own sexuality, my own agency in the world as an artist. My art education, my photography education intersects with my coming out story, which means from a very early age in my career, I started to think about sexuality and how to bring a conversation to the work, to the photographs I was taking at the time. And that centered the work spirally, I'll use that word, in my practice now. The conversation that relates to intersection of being queer, being Arab. I was born in Brazil, my mom's Paraguayan, I've been in the United States for 20 years. So how all that sort of plays out in my own positionality in the world. So that's where I sort of kind of come from on my practice. It's wonderful to be connected to all of you here. I feel very privileged to be an opportunity to meet everyone, and especially with Andrew because of the conversation we had in the past about my work, and then this conversation of understanding my work from a art historian point of view and understanding the large context into which my work plays out, and then be part of this exhibition has been extremely amazing for me in connect with you guys, coming from a time that the pandemic, right? We're all in lockdown. So just the idea of feeling connected, and then even a platform such as this, a discussion such as this to connect, right? And using Zoom, using this online platform that we're so used to now, right? To connect with people from all over the world. So this is really wonderful. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, guys. This was wonderful. I want to next ask you guys specifically, how do the labels queer, Arab, and artist, what do you think of them? Do they relate to you? Do they capture you? Do they annoy you? So in any order you guys want, can you reflect a little about these three labels and how do you identify with them and how they connect with you?
I'll jump right in and say that it's an interesting question because, you know, you base, like it all comes down to semantics, what the word means and what it implies for you as a person applying that adjective to yourself. And really thinking about that as far as who you are, what you represent, what you want to represent. In a weird way, there's so much overlap between the words queer and Arab for me as a queer Arab woman living in the States. Short answer is yes, I would identify with all three. Long answer is that the longer I identify with those three, the more I realize they're all presenting the same challenges as far as what counts, like what is queer, what is Arab, like do you need to speak Arabic, do you need to have lived there, do you need to have a certain skin tone? It's a very complicated question, right? And so is queerness, because it gets thrown around a lot. And both of them imply some kind of masking into society where you're blending yourself to mesh with whatever context you're in, especially particularly here in the United States. So I've been thinking about that a lot as far as queerness and Arabness overlapping in the sense of having to, like, feeling like you have to measure up to it in a way, or represent it in a particular way, which I don't necessarily think is healthy, but that's a society we live in. And I think it's important to connect in this kind of way, because having a discussion like this will clarify things for my own self and hopefully for everyone listening.
I grew up having a large genealogy tree print in my home of my Arab roots. So I was born in Brazil, and I grew up having that huge symbolic print, 40 by 30 inches, to give an idea of scale, right? And it was in the dining room of our home, going to my grandparents, they had also that genealogy tree. This idea that I am Arab, that I am connected to the Syrian world, or Turkish even world before Syria, right? What was that in the past? What was that territory in geography? And I grew up not only recognizing that as an identification that I'm Arab, my name is Arabic, but having a pride for it, having a very strong sense of connection and pride, like, and moving the world, and, you know, in high school and junior high, just living through that, already that understanding that I come from that part of the world, my heritage comes from there, but with a very sense of joy about it. When I moved to the United States, when I started to study as I mentioned, conversational art practice, and that conversation started to play into sexuality, and I'm coming out. Short after, it sort of about around the same time of coming out, September 11 happened here. And I became a walking stereotype for an Arab person. And that was a very hard thing to negotiate for me in relation to the umbrella of being Arab and being othered, right, in culture at large, because what happened with the violence and on September 11 and the tragedy, the trauma. And as I'm coming out, understanding my sexuality and embracing my sexuality, I also had to work through really hard to get to the moment of not only acceptance, but joy and pride that connects to my Arabness. So I feel like by growing up, I was instilled a sense of pride for being Arab. And I worked really, really, really hard to have that in my queerness, in my homosexuality, my gayness. And now the way that I work is to bring a sort of celebration of that. I am aware of the how complicated and layered all these categories are, and they are, right? They're categories. They're but there's a fluidity on that too. And for me, the way I think about that is using the category, using the Arabness, using the queerness to navigate in a way to talk about the work, but with a sense of, again, of pride, of confidence. And so I guess that's where I come from on this, on how to think about that, right? And how to think and how to move in the world with this identification, right? Because no matter where I am, because of my name, there's this, or the way I look, because of my beard even, there's this identification with being Arab, right? And then there's this categorization. And because my work is predominantly about sexuality, there's a conversation, oh, it's a queer art practice, or and I'm like, yeah, it is that and more. So we're kind of embracing that. So Andrew?
So for myself, I'm Egyptian. I'm a first generation Canadian because I am the first generation to be born of my immigrant parents who immigrated to Canada from Egypt. I know that the term second generation, all this is debated. I've always identified as first generation, and that was important to me because growing up my entire life, I was operating as an Egyptian. I'm living my life in society as an Egyptian due to the color of my skin, my curly hair, all of these things never made me a white man in society. So that idea of the cultural difference, I think similarly to Jamil and Laura, that difference was felt, right? As you're saying, you're operating in these different spaces. So being so culturally Egyptian, always speaking Arabic at home, being a part of the Egyptian community so intensely, also just made the Egyptianness in my life be felt more so than anything else, even though I grew up here in Canada. So that is what led to the work that I do. I do identify as queer. I am a gay man, and those frictions of where the queerness fit into my life, both as an Egyptian, but also a racialized Canadian. Those frictions that were created when I didn't quite fit into any of these spaces, because the Arab community is saying, well, coming out and being gay, that's a thing that's here. And then my parents have the same reaction where it's because we came to Canada. That's the problem. This is the issue, as though the gayness is somehow inherent to the West. So this not fitting in is what showed me we need to maybe have a different conversation, and not one that is based on the privilege of being here, the privileges of the wonderful gay life in the West, because that only reiterates that gayness and queerness has something to only do with United States or Canada or Europe. And it's that fallacy that I think created so many of the frictions that I felt in my own life. And that's, again, what led me to do the historical work that I do, and going back in time, looking at historical moments in the Middle East, across the region, to see what was gender like. What did gender and sexuality look like across time, and how did we get here? How did we get to this place today? And the reason why I think it's so important to link the diaspora to the historical Middle East is because when we look at how difficult our lives can be, or how bad the human rights can be in particular parts of the region for queer people, then we get stuck in this Orientalist debate of being backwards, of not having the human rights that are applauded in the West, as though, again, these rights are inherent to the privileges that we have here in the global North. So that's where this link became so powerful to me, and just making sense of my experiences, the violences that I experienced, the traumas that I experience, even though I'm born in Canada. And again, these frictions is just where these new conversations I found can be so valuable to be seen in different ways.
What wonderful, like, these are such beautiful, diverse answers. And Andrew, I want to ask you a little bit more later on about, like, to talk about the history of homoeroticism in the Middle East. I want to tack a little now and ask you guys about part of the idea of the show was to create a safe space where we can talk about the different aspects of these identities of Arabness, queerness, and art. And I think I want to ask Lara to begin with, and then Jamil, and then end with Andrew. Lara, you just saw the show yesterday. How did the conversation, the show, make you feel about your own identity, and how do you relate about being part of that community? And then Jamil, I'm curious to hear about how seeing your pieces in the collection or hung next to other queer Arab artists has influenced the way you view your art. And finally ending with Andrew, kind of like, how do you think this fits into the larger conversation? So starting off with Lara.
So the first thing that struck me in the gallery was a sense of relief and joy for a lot of the things that I've been resentful for in the past. So if we think about queerness as a sort of brand which exists in the West, as you were saying, Andrew, it's a very established, I don't want to say persona because that's very limiting and very negative, but there's certain aesthetic elements that are ubiquitous. There's certain ways of, modicums of behavior, etc., that are established. However, we as Arabs never really evolved a narrow tunnel of what queer behavior and what queer aesthetics look like. It's a blessing. When I walked into the gallery, I was struck by how diverse and eclectic the works were. They were clearly tied by the common thread of this sexual joy and ecstatic energy of queerness, which really is inherently tied to irreverence and to a rejection of status quo and the structure I was talking about earlier, which is such a fixture in my work. There was a curation, but there was no, regarded structure of what patterns are on the wall or what aesthetics are being presented. And that made me feel really comfortable and really safe, because I've constantly fought against not being able to align myself with any particular box or folder of aesthetic as an artist. And, to take it to Jamil's work and Andrew's work, there was that sense of like art history colliding with the contemporary, and this hold we have on our own history and our own historical aesthetic. Like Jamil, your works, it's this conflation of like this really sexy almost minimal, like contemporary aesthetic with these patterns that we recognize from our grandma's houses, you know, in these positions that we never thought we would see them in. I appreciate that so much. And it's something I try to reach with my own work, and seeing it all over the walls curated so beautifully, it made me feel like we are really creating and building something here in the West, which doesn't have to be limited to the West. As you were saying, Andrew, I have so much to say about that. I will hold my tongue for now because I feel like it will come up later, but it's a start, right? We have to start somewhere. And I think we're doing a great job of it here. I can only hope it will spill over and that this will become a ubiquitous practice for us all over the globe. And truly seeing it in person was not like seeing it online. And thank you all for your efforts in putting it together. It's a phenomenal show.
I've really praised everything you just said, Lara, because I feel very connected to that too in my own work. And I think in relation to the show is the conversation of possibilities, right? And point of views. Mm-hmm. I'm working, operating, you know, in California, San Francisco Bay Area, in my own community, right? And I'm trying to activate a conversation, right? And try to have my voice in my work, to have the work connected to other artists who are operating in similar way in intention, but with different approach. It's really wonderful. For me, I also have to think about how do I make work moving forward? I think the one very big impact for me of being connected in this show has to do with the conversation of like, wow, it's so energetic. There's something so wonderful. And how do I use this creative energy that I'm receiving from the work, from the exhibition, to put in the work to move forward? And understanding more and more how complex all these things are, and how my work is very, very personal. And I am making, I'm gonna use the word iconography, I'm using iconography, making these conversation, or using the taboo, right? To kind of bring the taboo upside down and try to challenge that. But through a very personal perspective, a point of view experience. And each one of the artists involved in the show is doing the same, I think, right? Through a very personal conversation. I think that's very wonderful, because it's not making this large, broad statements about this, what it is. I think it's more about this idea of being seen through your perspective and be acknowledged as such. So yeah, that's sort of my thoughts on that. I feel very fortunate to be part of the show, to be in this conversation here now, this conversation of carving the space to have this conversation. When I came out, my father said to me, do you think someone with my background, where I come from, will be able to accept this, right? And that really stayed with me, this conversation that he used his own cultural formation, identity, to say, I cannot accept that because of my lineage, my heritage, my bringing. And I feel that has carried so much in what I do now, and try to have a voice, and through externalizing a lot of that trauma that came from that. And in the exhibition, I see a lot of that too, right? There's a lot of, even though there's a celebration, there's a lot of intersection of trauma, right? Of visibility, of a deep desire to connect and to be accepted and to be, right? So yeah.
Jamila, I'd like to just comment. I love the perspective that you raise about like every artist in the show has almost brought part of their personal story in there, because it's like one of the things I tried my best to bring out in the show is to kind of highlight that underneath a lot of this artwork, a lot of this conversation is a personal story. Most of us have been struggling with something, with figuring out which of these different words is our identity, how to mix them together in a society that wants to see you from a certain perspective. And I want to answer one of the questions that I think might fit here better rather than later on to the Q&A. Hilal asks a question of like, about me including some of my artwork in the show, which is, I struggled with it as a curator, whether to include pieces of my artwork or not. But what kind of like drove me finally to include 4 of my pieces is the show itself, as I processed it, as I kind of worked on it, made me realize the queerness that is within my artwork, and that my story is part of this larger conversation, which we will all part of. And so it really helped me figure out that this is my community, and I kind of am part of it. Andrew, I'm curious to hear your perspective now, because you're literally a scholar of this, and what is your perspective on queer Arab art and how this show fits into it, and how our different stories fit into the larger narrative. And if you can segue from there to talking about historical legacy of homoeroticism in the Arab world, that would be a wonderful segue.
Sure. So one thing that I think is so successful about the exhibition, and I think how we should be discussing queer Arab art, is this loosened geographic structure. So I had talked about being Egyptian, but it's so important to me that I recognize that we can have such a plurality of experiences that are similar when we come from different parts of the region. So a strictly queer Lebanese aesthetic certainly might exist. But I think talking about a queer Lebanese artist alongside a queer Egyptian artist, alongside a queer Syrian artist, all these things can actually give us so much more information on why things are the way they are in terms of law, societal changes, and the differences within the region as they happened over time. None of these borders are fixed, none of them are finite, and have always changed over time. So for us to think today in the logic of the colonial borders, I think stops our conversation from building empathy with one another and really thinking about how our identities intersect. And that's why even in my research, I always define the Middle East and the region through language, through empire, through culture, through traditions, and most often all the regions that were formerly a part of the Ottoman Empire, right? So just saying that I'm going to focus on this country or this nation has never been a part of my mission. It's never been a part of the way I operate or view our lives, our experiences, or the art from this region, because I think that the connections that some people might find not connected at all as being exactly what is so valuable in this discussion, in this conversation, especially when we bring diaspora and migration into that again. The nation state and borders make very little sense for our conversations. So to take that into the question of the history of homoeroticism in the Arab world, what I see in the research is how queer identity and gay identity simply didn't exist. It didn't exist in the Middle East. It didn't exist in the Ottoman Empire. It didn't exist in the region throughout history. These are very new concepts, new ideas, new languages, new terminology that was brought to the Middle East by European travelers, by imperialism, by colonial conquests. So much of the Middle East was taken over and under control by either the French or the British or both in different periods of time. And what that meant is their culture starts to replicate in an act of colonial violence. So when the British would come, they then compare themselves to the other culture that they're in. So one of the one of the historical records that I find so interesting is travel journals, because it tells you exactly these cultural differences. So someone like William Owsley was the British ambassador of Persia in the 19th century. He so famously writes in his travel journals how, you know, these men, they have sex with anything. They have sex with women, they have sex with men, they might as well have sex with dogs. And you see how this confrontation of gender fluidity and this confrontation of a society that operates its sexual codes differently than a Victorian United Kingdom, that is what created so many frictions. And then when you look at how homosexuality became illegal from these attitudes, from these moments, you can look at the censorship. You can look at what was permitted to be published during the Victorian era in the Middle East, right? How did, for example, publications of 1001 Nights start to get sanitized? How did different narratives start to get sanitized throughout history to remove any type of homoerotic history? We have manuscripts, we have paintings, we have a very rich visual history of homoeroticism, of two women engaging in sex, two men engaging in sex, whatever you might have, but it was never labeled as gay. It was never labeled as queer. And when the Western terminology started to come into the Middle East and that discourse started to take over, the erasure of homoeroticism, like two men holding hands, for example, doesn't need to have any type of sexual connotation. These things start to get interpreted through a lens of a gayness or through the lens of a queerness. And that unfortunately creates violences, and it's what created the illegality of a queerness. So I'll just end on that note of why it's illegal and how it's illegal and where. Well, again, we need to, I find it so useful to historicize homophobia for this exact reason. It's not enough to just settle on the fact that the Middle East is somehow violent and homophobic. That is not good enough. We need to remember where these laws came out, what are the specifics of these laws, and in so many of the places, they are British laws, right? They are actually Victorian laws or French laws, like the buggery laws that they had in Britain that come into Lebanon and come into Egypt, and we have these anti-sodomy laws, and we forget how in the global north at that time, in France, in Britain, homosexuality was illegal according to law. And it's only recent that these laws changed. Like, look at the United States. Gay marriage was only legalized in 2015. So breaking that automatic assumption of queerness as equaling human rights, as equaling something that is native to and born out of the global north, is another act of imperial and colonial violence, because the homophobia that we see in the Middle East has already been shaped by coloniality, has already been triggered and created because of colonial logics that separate another culture as other. So we need to really reassess where that homophobia comes from and really always push back in that logic that the homophobia is somehow native and innate in us, and somehow feeding into that Orientalist discourse. So I'll stop there.
Andrew, I'm gonna jump in because I find this extremely important for me to think about, because I question so much, where does the rejection come from? And for me, it was always a conversation of the violence is a result of that rejection. And I'm always trying to figure out, where does the rejection, where does it start? Where does it become so prevalent in culture? right? That then allows the violence, that propels the violence forward. And has always been a conversation of trying to figure that out for me. I think what you just gave me here is a very sort of wonderful clarification. I'm going to use that word, right? In thinking about to answer some of these questions, right? Because I think it's so problematic when we start engaging in the conversation of the work and you want to disrupt this continuum, you want to challenge this, but at the same time to think about that this is also constructed, that prior to this colonial concept, something else is in place, right? I went to Greece and Turkey 2.5 years ago. And my entire process being in those countries was going to museums, going to find, if I could find a trace of representation of queerness. And you see so much, you see through a vase, a painting on a vase, right? You see that there is that presence that exists. And for me, that has been such an important, inspiring content to see, because I recognize myself in that lineage, right? Even though it's so old, and to understand that that existed, right? And again, the conversation then is like, but somewhere the violence really played a major role in creating obstacles around, right? And when I say violence, it's something that I consider in my work, because I'm producing my work. I also think about my own life. Depending on the content that goes online, I feel skittish of, should I even this exist online? When I say, hi, from Oakland, I live somewhere, what is sort of the connections and danger that allows, that kind of connects to that. Anyway, it's a very complicated conversation, right? And yeah,
if I can add just
yes.
one thing, it's when you're linking the violence to that rejection, one word I didn't use was modernity. And I think modernity is really the bullseye on where these issues come from. Because when the European visitors and travelers are comparing themselves, it's comparing their own sense of modernity to a Middle East that is primitive. Now, that concept of being modern and how you fit into modernity so quickly became only a Western model of modernity. So again, when we make these things illegal, when we create censorship of the homoerotic visual culture that existed throughout history, all of those things are acts by the Middle East to become modern in the vision of the West, right? And that's where the violence, I think, happens. I think that exact spot is where the rejection is already created by being able to identify a culture as primitive and inferior through that logic and unmodern. And that is what leads to violence and erasure. I think, I think you said it so beautifully, because that rejection also, it looks like it came up overnight, right? How can you have something that is so accepted within society, within culture, that starts to get denormalized in a moment when society is changing? And these are also times of decolonization as well. When did heterosexualization in the Middle East happen? When the French left, when the British left, right? In these moments of decolonization all throughout the Middle East, how did a heterosexualized vision of society come about? And I think once again, in historicizing a lot of this homophobia, we can see that heterosexualization is manufactured, right? It's manufactured and is still a result of the erased homoeroticism that resulted in a Western modernity that the Middle East can never achieve. Because now that modernity is linked to gay rights and having gay pride parade and gay marriage and all the things that we identify as being gay in the global north, this is then where the goalpost of modernity keeps moving because the West moves it, right? So it's this unattainable goal to ever reach modernity when the rules are always changing and defined by those who want to hold on to the exclusion of others.
So that's the thing too. I think a lot about who is creating these constructs, who is defining these roles. And it really bugs me that for so long, it's been in the hands of an arbitrarily, racially and geographically selected sort of global elite who it just falls upon them to define what is modernity, what is acceptable, what is a taboo. And their definition of taboo that they deposited upon us, as you said, Andrew, historically, they were able to leave, move on, leave us with political systems in place that were doomed for failure in many cases. I'm Lebanese, I can speak specifically to Lebanon and the state that France left us in, with a confessionalist government, which literally doesn't exist anywhere else on the planet. You can look it up, like where your political slots are designated by religion. That's just one example of what are the shitty systems they left us with, went back home, moved on with their lives, progressed, gay rights, work, we're free, we're happy, banned the burqa. Meanwhile, they left their colonial projects to struggle with the systems they left in place. And it's incredibly unjust that we have to grapple with systems that are not of our own choosing, when in fact we had in place systems before that were designated by us for us, that weren't perfect, but worked in some sense. And I mean, the whole thing about imperialism is the last thing to decolonize is the mind of the colonized themselves, right? So we have, I myself, as much as I'm working hard to untangle all of these narratives that have been ingrained inside of me, I still struggle with it. And I can observe it for what it is, but they're still there. And I really think that we are of a generation and of a movement who are working to break free of that, but it's still very real and very present. You know, you see it. You see all the stigmas that were imposed upon us, that we live with, that we think about ourselves. Even the West as superior, and the Middle East or West Asia, or whatever we're calling it these days, as inferior and as like incapable of making our own decisions and constantly in trouble. That's a narrative that, you know, I believe it as much as I don't want to. Do you know what I'm saying? Like
And
go ahead.
The conversation of West and East is so also problematic, because to think about South America, Latin America, right? And the concept of machismo in a lot of those countries, right? Coming from Brazil, the machismo as a colonial concept as well, right? To navigate on that. And so there's something else on that conversation, right? Just it's we can say in relation to West and East, but I think it's more complicated even to that, right? It's like this conversation of where does the power or the colonization actually comes from, right? And the impact on that. And that goes to racism, that goes to where we are in conversation of Black Lives Matter, right? Like it's all rooted in so many politics that it's not only about sexuality, but then becomes about race. And
you know, what you said is also important. You know, like the metric of machismo is super important too, because it's not women making these decisions. You know, it's not women invading other countries and forcing them to convert to another religion. Like historically, that just has never happened.
I totally agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
I'm
a
glad you brought it
conversation
up.
of, yeah, it's a conversation,
you know,
of the structure of men in power, right? Like there's that.
Straight
I'm
men.
loving the
Yeah.
conversation, and
That history, right? Exactly that history of the who is in power, who got, you know, like, and the conversation, this is interesting because I was having a conversation at home about this structure of power, that in civilization there's always someone, like civilization has always created a structure of power, right? And then who oppressed and who is oppressed and who is oppressor, like this negotiations, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
I'm loving our conversation about modernity and about East and West. And I wanted to highlight a couple of points and ask specifically something to Lara. One of the interesting things that when Andrew, you talked about the history of criminalizing homosexual behavior or male homosexual behavior, one of the facts that I ran into researching this project is that the Ottoman Empire decriminalized homosexual behavior 5 years before the English Empire made it illegal. So that's like, if you want to talk about who's being progressive, who's being modern, that's one side. And the other part that blew my mind, Andrew, I give you credit for this. This book, I think you reference it in your essay. It's Before Homosexuality in the Arab Islamic World. I don't know how to make it appear. I'll try to write the name of it, but it's a fascinating discourse, and it's all primary sources of letters written between different scholars and travelers who are Arab about homosexuality, in which they reference homosexuality. And it was the first time that I encountered that in the Arab language, there is a word for someone who is a bottom that's existed for 2,000 years. Which amazed me that existed, that language was evolved enough 2,000 years ago to have space for that. And so I highly recommend this as a read for anyone who wants to explore more about some of the history of homosexuality within the Middle East without the labels. And I have a very interesting perspective, a question for you, Lara, because as we're having these conversations here, we're talking about East versus West. Let's take perspective on, we are sitting where most of us are in the West and having these conversations. And I'm curious, how do these dialogues or this discussion affect what's going on in Lebanon or any of the other Arab world? Or are conversations in a way affecting, percolating, reaching, continuing with conversations there? Or have we become part of the West, and are we discussing our discussion being separate from what is going on in the Middle East? And so starting off with Lara, and then I'm curious to hear Andrew's perspective on this as well as Jamil's.
I've grappled with this a lot in my 7 years since I moved here. The feeling of privilege, the feeling of feeling distanced in a way from home. And the idea that I have friends in Lebanon now who don't know where their next meal is going to come from because of the economy collapse, and they are traumatized from the explosion that happened in August. And as much as my heart is a part of that, and as much as my soul is a part of that, my life is here in New York for the moment. So it's a question that really, it's been on my mind a lot, right? And my work as an artist here, as someone who wants to be a voice for queerness and for Arabness in the West, I've questioned many times, is this my right audience? Is this the place where I should be? Could I do more good back home? Is this going to help my friends who are struggling with their situation in Lebanon? Probably not. You know, the truth is, I don't think that this particular Zoom call will have a direct impact. However, what I will say, which I do think is important and I hang on to every day, is the fact that if you have the privilege to live here in the West, and you have the privilege to be an artist or a creative, you have a megaphone. You've been granted an opportunity to raise issues, discuss them, untangle them, complicate them, simplify them. And if you don't use that to tackle these issues, then shame on you. So I feel like this is what we should be doing. It's the best we can do. And I, as a closeted optimist, like to think that down the line, these conversations will lead to an eventual generational shift in the narratives that we have ingrained from the British, from the French, from ourselves, from the war trauma, from the inferiority complex that comes with being a brown person, a queer person, an Arab, however you want to identify. So in a practical sense, this is mostly for us. And I also feel that as diaspora, we need to lean on each other for support, because it's not easy to be here and have your pain hidden in a white presenting body sometimes, you know, in a straight presenting body. So it's important for us as a collective, absolutely. And we can carry it back home with time, with all of our efforts and conversations and exhibitions, I think.
For me, it has been always a conversation of responsibility. What is my responsibility through this channel that I'm using artistically, right? I made a decision. It was a decision for me in my life. I didn't want to make art for aesthetic purposes, to put in a wall for beauty. That was not the conversation. I can use beauty as a strategy, but that's not the end of the work. And to think about how do I feel is my responsibility as an artist. My privilege of being able to be visible, my privilege as a man. So like using these things as well as part of the feel of the work, as part of the work, the conversation of the work. And acknowledging that too, because I had to make a decision too. I had to kind of think about, where do I go? What do I want? What do I, what do I want the work to go? What kind of direction, right? And have hold of that, and then have control of that. Okay, this is where I want to kind of manifest. What's going to happen is out of my hands, but my intention of where I put the manifestation is very clear to me on that responsibility.
One of the things that really worries me is that as immigrants or people who come to the US or other countries, as we settle here, that our queerness becomes a third kind of queerness. We're no longer our local queerness or Arab queerness or the country we came from. We're trying, as time goes by, we integrate into the local queerness, and our dialogue becomes no longer heard back home. We no longer have an effect back home. How do we continue to have a conversation, not only in the country we immigrated to, but in the country we immigrated from? How do we not become completely subsumed by the culture we come into? And I'm curious, Andrew, if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, it's so challenging, because me personally, I write about the diaspora because this is my subject position that I know and live. The issue is this idea of purity, this idea of who is authentic enough to speak for who. And this is where I find conversations get really messy, because I think that we can understand our privilege in the diaspora, in living like a place like Canada or the United States, once again, using the megaphone that Laura's talking about, while not marginalizing the voices and the people and identities that are still in the Middle East either. And I think having conversations between one another, as opposed to identifying the differences between each other, might be more productive. Because what I found is this idea of, people saying so flippantly of like, oh, like, why would you talk about the Middle East when you're living in the diaspora? As though the cultural attitudes from the Middle East don't affect my life. Right. And again, that's where my research started. When I first started doing this work, someone told me, well, why? Like, what's the issue? You live in Canada. Why does this matter? Why is it so bad? And that discourse not only erases my Egyptian identity here in Canada, but it also erases any sort of trauma, homophobia, or racism, or a mixture of those that can happen even though I live in Canada. So just assuming, I guess it's just the erasure of where these violences can happen at different, for example, here, sure, homosexuality is not prohibited by law, but the place where queerness can thrive here in Canada might also be the place where racism is most rampant, right? So again, those intersections of how homophobia works with racism is where this idea of being in the diaspora versus staying or still living in the Middle East doesn't need to create oppositional sides. And I think instead there can be a much more productive conversation to have that can connect all of these experiences as well to make all of our discussions richer.
I agree 100%. And I think that like our strength is in that connection. Our strength is in the ones who were born in the blood, like back home, and in the ones who were born abroad, and in the ones who chose to move abroad, and in the ones who chose to move back. And I will just say this one thing, Andrew, I'm extremely sick and tired of people who have no right to claim, like to just apply labels on you based on your situational facts. You know what I mean? You're born here, you look a certain way, you count, you don't count, you're this, you're that. Like, leave me alone. Like you are what you are, and no one has a claim on that. And like, small anecdote, I had a white woman at a party here in Brooklyn look at me, and after I described myself as a brown person, look at me and be like, oh, but you're white. And I was like, excuse me? And she's like, you're white, look at your skin. I was like, do you have anything else to say? Do you want to tell me like what my sexuality is? Do you want to tell me what my religion is? Do you want to tell me what foods I like to eat? It's this like entitlement to impose an appraisal of you that happens a lot in the West, not to take it back there. And I'm really glad, I'm just really happy to hear someone else bring it up, because it's been coming up a lot for me. And even some people back home who are judging me differently now that I live in the States and I've been here for 7 years. And no one can tell you who you are. That's all I'm saying. Like,
Laura, that's fascinating. I'm always scared of the other way around. At some point, I was having a conversation with my uncle about gay rights, and at some point, he's frustrated and couldn't kind of like counter argue, and he falls down on, you've spent way too much time in the West. I think you're going crazy or you're being infected.
They made you gay.
I mean, the idea, but like, I think there is that rhetoric that gayness and queer identity, and there is some aspect within, I would say, at least from my home country, Jordan, but I could see that in many other countries, that some of the rhetoric about queer identity is a Western import. And because a lot of the dialogue that comes out in English, comes out by people who are not necessarily Arab. So of course that's going to come across as foreign to them. And there's not as much being developed in a language that people relate to as their own. And that's my struggle always. How do I make my my practice also relevant in the region as much as it is relevant here to a Western audience? One of the pieces in the show is by Queer Habibi, and it has two men wearing fezzes, and that always blows my mind, because that is not how an Arab person would draw himself to another Arab man. That is only how an Arab would draw himself to a Western gaze. And so like, it's almost that there is a different way, there's different gazes looking at us, a Western, Eastern one. And I'm looking at Andrew, and I'm thinking kind of like, you might find this problematic, and I'm very curious to hear you deconstruct this. But like, I worry about kind of like, by engaging in a Western side, we lose our engagement with the Eastern discussion.
Yeah, I just want to jump in. I don't think it's problematic. I think instead you actually point to something that's very interesting, right? What would happen if some of these works, what happens when a work that portrays tenderness and homosexuality in ways that fall outside of normative queerness or gayness, like doesn't necessarily look like a Robert Mapplethorpe exhibition, for example, how would those images operate differently in the United States versus in Lebanon? How would the audience receive the same image as being about something else, right? So how can we instead really look at the visuals and the images itself as being related to the specific cultural practices and societal attitudes of where they're exhibited? And when we think of it in those terms, it becomes really interesting to me if we can have you know, examples of artworks or artists that can operate in both spaces. And then it shows us that it's not necessarily the wrong language or the wrong conversation. And instead, it's being more attuned to how audiences receive the signs of queerness. So it's really how one reads queerness in an image, right? And really being able to figure out culturally where that queerness comes out visually, where it becomes interpreted as being queer, as opposed to other forms of intimacy.
I find that fascinating. And two examples, one of the artists I was talking to whose work features women cross-dressing, and her work was shown in UAE, and the reason it escaped censorship because it didn't register as queer, it registered as comedy. Everyone found it hilarious. Oh, a woman cross-dressing. And there was the artist, I'm blanking on his name, but he was in that symposium you organized, the Turkish artist, who the censors were told to take down the images of men in the show that had on them projected porcelain tiles. But when the censors went to take down the offending images, they couldn't tell which images were offending because they couldn't even pick up the queerness because they saw this as normative in their eyes. And so like, sometimes it's fascinating how like what we consider queer in the West is normative in the East.
Yes, absolutely. That artist name is Sarp Karam Yavuz. And absolutely, I found that really fascinating as well, because I discovered Sarp's artwork visiting that gallery when I was in Istanbul. And the queerness is immediately what I identified when I was in that space and looking at the way he photographed these men, the way these men are portrayed on the walls, right? The way I was able to read the queerness is what made us connect in the first place. And it's that very same space, that very same context that the police were unable to read any queerness in the art and couldn't identify what was what. So it's yeah, that's a great example to bring into this conversation.
And then Jamil, I'm very curious to hear how your work kind of resonates back home. Are you aware of how that resonates back home? Has an impact in Brazil? Are you aware of any of that?
Not much in Brazil. I find that, how do I place this? I've carved and I fought through so many years to have a platform in the Bay Area, in where I am, where I live, right, and create my own community. And I didn't have the same opportunities in Brazil. And every time that I tried to show the work there or try to engage in that conversation there, I encountered so many no's and blocks that I kind of navigated away from the pursuit. So it's based on my own experience on being here, and then where the work goes, why my work reached Andrew in Canada, right? And then sort of the work goes places, right? And some places the work doesn't go. And so to think about Brazil, I don't have the same level of experience to say, oh, I never really had an opportunity. Unfortunately, I love to. I just never had the chance to engage in exhibitions there, or yeah. So it's I want to bring back just one thing in relation to a conversation of responsibility that was brought up in the chat, and I'm thankful for Mohammed for bringing that up, and I fully understanding the privilege by this conversation of who gets to be responsible or not. the way that I addressed was in my own work. This is something very personal that I had to decide for myself. And I feel that many artists have a different journey on that food, and I respect that. I just want to clarify that I understand my privilege by being in the Bay Area, by being, well, for being born in Brazil, I understand that in a way that informs the work and propels the work. And I use that as a choice for, in the work and how I produce the work. So when I say responsibility, I'm not saying that everybody has to have that at all. I'm saying that for myself, that how has manifested and then being a choice and being an awareness within my work and using that as an agency to propel future works, for example. So just a clarification on that. Yeah.
I want to reflect towards, like, as we kind of come full circle. Laura, I'm curious about your perspective on when we talk about queer Arab art. Is there enough representation of women? Do you find, I'm always curious whether the queer women escape being read as queer and just pass, or are we not doing a good enough job of identifying them and including them in the conversation? And it could be a bit of both. So I just wanted to pick your brain about that, and everyone else also feel free to chime in.
Can I also just add to that question? Not only is it, Q, you're asking the difficulty in identifying the queerness of women, but what about also the queerness of female artists in the region as well, the queerness of the image itself? Can these queer female artists also be operating, and we fail to see the queerness because it isn't represented in the way that we're used to? Just to add on to the question.
Anything else, guys? I'm joking. No, I love it. I love it. I'm a chatty cat. So to start with, here's the funny thing. And this is something I've experienced, like, as an artist, as a grown-up, all the way back to when I was in high school, and that one straight friend gets really drunk and you're her, like, token gay friend who she wants to make out with because she's drunk and she's mad at her boyfriend. Like, it manifests in all kinds of ways where you are unseen and undervalued for who and what you are, and it's kind of brushed aside because you happen to have a vagine, that your queerness is just, they're girls. It's just two girls. It's innocent. It's harmless. Whereas two men is this whole other fiasco that's regarded with this weight and this seriousness. That's something I've always resented because, sexual fluidity is sexual fluidity regardless of what you have under your jeans or your sweatpants, I guess. Pandemic. But I've always struggled with the fact that my queerness is invisible, erased, as you said, Andrew, earlier. I like the word erasure a lot. Disregarded because of being a female. So Q, when you ask, are we disregarding it? We being this circle, we being this demographic who are so conscious and who are like spending their afternoon on a Saturday discussing this because we're so committed to breaking down these boundaries and, creating identifications for ourselves and each other that are meaningful and updated and important. No, I feel very seen. I feel very respected. We as a society, as a globe, as a whole, absolutely. Within this small inner circle, I think we're doing all the right work to acknowledge female queerness. Also, the whole term woman is very complicated, right? Like, I'm a cis woman with a mustache on, but like, I think about my trans sisters, like they're also invisible in a way, but we're doing all the right work. And to answer your question, Andrew, as an artist, like, it's almost a currency here in the US. It's interesting. Back in Lebanon, no one wants to talk about it. They will pretend they don't see it. It's like your mom and dad pretending sex doesn't exist, hoping you will never have sex. But it's kind of the same thing there. Whereas here, it's almost the polar opposite, where your value increases the more disenfranchised you are as a being or an entity. So Arab, check. That's a point. Muslim, that's another check. Queer, check. Woman, big check. So like, gallerists and collectors, they really get off on that. And like, there's this white, Yeah, there's this like kind of white apologistic sympathetic collector base who are buying up artists who are minorities and gay because that's hot right now, that's what's cool on the market. So I've experienced a radical rejection of that when I was younger, where I was making work that was consciously objective, not about my life, not about my identity, because I didn't want to play into that card. I thought that was an act of defiance. But really, it was just hurting my work, because as soon as I was able to insert myself and my identity, my work got a whole lot better. As Jamil was saying, the more personal, the more you tell your story, the more unique and impactful your work becomes, I feel, as an artist. But there is an interesting reaction to it here. Being a queer woman artist in the US, it's kind of fetishized. Part of me is like, play the market, girl, pay your rent. And part of me is like, that's disgusting. Go take a shower. That's not who you are. So I'm trying to balance that, you know, and drag is helpful. Drag is this beautiful thing I discovered where I can subvert all of that, still be who I am through the lens of a male body, I suppose, or male impersonation, where the womanhood of all of it is put on a shelf for a second.
A beautiful answer, Lara. I want to ask one last question before allowing some questions from the audience. And one of the interesting ways to relate to the word queerness or queer is it's a very nebulous word that can include and not include a lot of people. In the show, I choose to use queer to include people who are, to define not necessarily sexual queerness, but including any work that doesn't fit a particular paradigm. So you don't have to be gay to have queer artwork. How do you feel about or some people term this as heterosexual queerness, or queerness that defining or having queerness be inclusive of non-homosexual things?
Can I jump in? Because I think it's really annoying when cis straight people call themselves queer. I'm like, you haven't lived it. Like you can't just grab that label because it's cool. Sorry, that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, if I can jump in too, like the term you just said, I disagree with, I think, in just the polarity of a heterosexual queer, but also I do think what you said in terms of a straight artist producing queer work can exist, but this is where we need to discuss the specifics, right? I think that this is where, just speaking broadly, that's where it's going to get messy. You know, for example, there's an artist who is straight, but she photographs queer refugees, and it's about queerness, it's about queer migration, it's about all these things, that is about the people in the photographs, the sexuality, right? So the subjects who are in the artwork itself that audiences are viewing themselves are queer, as are the narratives, as are the lenses in which these things are depicted, visualized, and conceptualized within the artwork. So the queerness in that example, I think is to me is undisputed, right? Whether the fact that artists may themselves not be queer, at the very least might be an ally or might have some affinity to these things. And at the end of the day, the artwork itself still depicts queerness, depicts queer people, and is about a queer subject position. It's when we, again, remove the specificity and talk about that queerness so broadly that I think there are many of those situations where it might not fit, just because, you know, I don't know, someone wants to queer the way they paint in this more abstract philosophical route, then the word loses its meaning in some capacity. And I think that it's a word that has political weight that is useful. So losing that, I don't think benefits anyone, really.
Interesting. In one of the other artists that we did online, in Rima's work, she talked about the role of belly dancers as queer entities within Arab history. And in my mind, belly dancers are definitely part of the queer continuum. How and why, I don't know why. I can't defend it specifically, but that's my gut reaction. And in my mind, or I choose the definition that like queerness is not just about sexuality, it's about broader than that. But I'm curious to hear from the whole panel. Jamil, do you fall on either side of this?
My sister once called me on the phone and she was like, "What is queer?" And she was like, what is this terminology they used? And I'm trying to explain, right, my own definition and what I understand about it, and the conversation that is something that also I've learned, right? I learned as a concept. I learned to understand what actually this umbrella is, right? And for me, what has become more and more defined, but it's flexible. It's not fully defined, but it's more resolved in this understanding, is this way to think of queerness as this other side for heteronormativity, right? This fixed normativity, colonial-based understanding. So I've kind of embraced queerness as this umbrella that is in opposition, is in rebellion, maybe, is in a definition that is outside of this hetero binary category that is so fixed in society. And so I come to sort of embrace that in that. But then it's very personal as well, right? When you talk to someone who grew up really understanding that word queerness from a very, very early age, as opposed to me who learned that word later in my life, it's a different way of operating, understanding, embracing that word, the definition of that word. So even this definition that I'm giving you now is part of something that I've learned and I've come to understanding based on things that I read, or so, and it's expanding. So queerness expansion too, right? There's also embracing that possibility. There's this idea of possibility, right? This idea of what is not binary.
Yes.
Right?
Jamil, I love your perspective on the idea that us as people who learned the word later on, but rather than grew up with it, might perceive it as a different way and might take more liberty with it compared to those who have like basically struggled to make it exist for a long time. And like, I love the idea of queer as non-normative, whatever it is, a more broad perspective. But at the same time, I don't think there is any consensus on the use of word queer. If anything, there is consensus that no one has ownership on the definition of it. I am going to open up the space for people to type questions in the chat room, and also for our panelists if they want to ask each other or ask us questions. And I want to.
I have a question. Andrew, what is in that book?
So thank you for asking. When you had brought up the queerness of belly dancing, so let me just bring this picture in. Do you see this?
Yeah.
Does everyone see this image? So this is someone called a Kochek from the Ottoman Empire. This picture was taken in Cairo. In here you have a boy who's belly dancing. This is part of a cultural tradition that was very common of having male belly dancers, again, a gender queerness. So Q, you saying that the belly dancing itself can come from this queer history, I think is so correct and so accurate. And really what we're seeing today of belly dancing as being something that's gendered, again, comes from that heterosexualization. This is the exact censorship that I was discussing earlier. these dancers were in religious ceremonies, cultural ceremonies, indiscriminately. And then around this time of increased contact with Western explorers and travelers, that's when these performers disappeared. There
Can
have
you
been
please share
records.
that book? The name of that book? This is
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
Absolutely.
Maybe send in the link. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
I love the book.
It's The Homoerotics of Orientalism by Joseph Allen Boone. He's a wonderful scholar.
Thank you.
That's fantastic. I was gonna, in the meantime, we've had a few questions from Hilal, and Shauki also writes questions. So I just want to acknowledge Hilal. We've had a number of conversations, and Hilal actually curated the first queer Arab art show in New York City. It was quite a fantastic art show. I never got to see it, but some friends went there. And he asked about my use of the name Earl of Bushwick in the colonial terms. A lot of my artistic persona is playful and kind of making fun, and makes fun of the idea Bushwick is a rundown neighborhood, and kind of to be the Earl of somewhere, kind of where arts are up and coming, is kind of a fun joke that I'm using for my persona. Does anyone want to tackle Shauki's answer?
Yes. So I feel like these words, these phrases, these adjectives can be limiting. You're absolutely right. And I think it can be problematic to define yourself with a word and work backwards from that to define who you are and how you want to live your life. 100%, absolutely. I don't know if it derails, because it is also important to represent your community, and we need some kind of way to delineate what our community is. I'm not here representing like Rebecca from Wisconsin. She has her own issues to deal with, like, you know what I'm saying? So queer and Arab, they as much as queer is a term that in and of itself defies definition, like etymologically, ontologically, it's resisting any kind of restriction. It does define a certain community. Arab does the same. That's a whole other complicated can of worms that I'm not going to get into. What Arab means, I'm Lebanese, some people think we're Phoenician. But regarding the megaphone of being an artist, I mean, I struggle with the idea that being an artist means you need to be an educator. I don't necessarily think that our work needs to enlighten people. If it does, great. I don't know that that's the purpose for me, but what I do want to do, what is important to me, is to change narratives. We have internalized narratives about who we are, about who the West is, about hierarchical superiority based on cultural paradigms. And I would like to affect that with my work. That's what I'm going after. So it's not about the identity itself. It's about how we self-identify, how our bodies are politicized, how the West views us, how we view ourselves, the whole interaction between the two. That's what I feel the megaphone is useful for. I don't know that we can, like, we're not going to change the government. Let's be real. Like, I can't have a solo show in New York and overthrow this trash group of men who've been destroying my country for 30 years. What I can do is change the way that people think about cultural identity and political identity. Choking.
In that manner, I think also about visibility, right?
Yeah.
The idea of carving space for visibility, and think about my work in that manner as well, in a way of is to be seen, to reflect, right? To think about your own opportunity to also be visible, or to see this familiar thing somewhere else being represented, right? Like, I struggle so much early in my career when learning about queer artists. Think about Mapplethorpe, even Andrew mentioned about that, in relation to, like, there's a history, there's a lineage, but where do I connect? Where am I in this? And then creating work that acknowledges my own visibility within that, and then touching other people for seeing that visibility being present. So there's something on that level. So as a megaphone, I don't know. I think I have a hard time with the word megaphone, because I don't understand my work in that way. I understand my work as is a social commentary as much as a personal expression, as much as a cultural question, as much as a manifestation of a heritage that is complicated and intersecting and layered in so many ways. So.
I also think a lot about the idea of identities, and I think of them as different hats that we wear at different times. So each of us has about 100 different other identities: an uncle, a brother, a teacher, whatever they are. And we open our closet and pick the identities that we need for this conversation. And so there are some identities that are less used, like the ones we're exploring now, a combination of queer and Arab and artists. Other identities most people have no problem using, like uncle or brother or sister. And I think in this setting, we use these identities because we want to be visible. We want to highlight the intersection of these three and that there are people representing it. That doesn't necessarily mean we are no longer activists in somewhere else, that we are no longer passionate about other causes. One could be multi-passionate about many things. One could still advocate for many different things. But for today, we choose to wear these three hats.
May I say something?
Please.
Well, my question stemmed from a very important question that was brought earlier. And I do agree with Lara with the point that she had mentioned and shared, that sometimes she speaks about the efficiency of her art to change things. And you brought up the issue of what does my art change and what might art change. I am Lebanese. I've been here in this country for 40 years. Yes, it's one of the very, very, very few and almost rare public forum where I would say I am in the closet. And I am, after all these years, after 40 years in America, I don't dare to say to my family that I am, even though maybe it's in their mind. But, you know, with the issue of visibility, I find that my visibility as a gay artist is not as important as my visibility as someone who is very human, who is really using my pain and my the arrows that society has thrown at me, whether it's my religion, whether it's my background, whether it's my family, whether it's loved one, that in itself, for me, I'm talking about myself, has become what really gives my art the fire that it takes. And I've been for 40 years in America dealing with societal issues that are so overwhelming. I mean, if Picasso in his Guernica didn't change anything, I'm not that stupid to think that I can change anything. She is absolutely right. But what I want to say, yes, we are aware that our art is a platform. When you are having a public show, when you are having a lecture, when you are having a panel discussion, my big question that I struggle with is, what is it that is most important to me? Yes, my identity as, I'm using your words that you brought up, gay Arab artist. Yeah, I'm not gay, I'm not Arab, and I'm not an artist. I'm a human being. What do I want to talk about as a human being? I guess this is what I wanted to address in my question.
Yeah, there's a deep desire for us to connect on a human level, right?
I promise you, that's why I'm here. I am yearning for connection. I am yearning for people who speak my voice. I am yearning to connect with people who may have the incredible gift. It's a gift. And that, I am a professor. I teach at George Mason. I speak to my students with this language, how the fire in your belly, the fire that burns you, the fire that turns you to ash and smoke is the very fire that gives you energy and heat to really give light to yourself and to people around you. And this is, for me, the essence of what this past hour and a half has been about. So I cannot thank you enough.
No, Shauki, I want to thank you for sharing that with us. That was a really crowning discussion to end our day. And there's just so much beauty and strength in everything that you just said. And I would actually like you to address the question that you asked in terms of the language and identities that you're saying you disidentify with. What are some strategies then in your own work that you might find useful, that other people might find useful? Have you found maybe certain languages or tropes or things that have helped?
I gave everybody my website and my email. It's really up to you to stay in touch. And I would invite everybody to look at the work that I did in the past 40 years in America. You will see my heart and my mind and my soul. I tell my students, I don't paint with oil paint. I paint with my blood, with my tears, and with my soul, with my fear, with my aspiration, with my pain. And you know what? I'm not stupid. People tell me, why do you keep painting what you're painting? You're not selling anything. I said, you know what? Thank God. You know, I came from Lebanon. I didn't speak English and I didn't have $1 in my pocket. I'm not starving. As long as I have this fire, I'm not gonna sell it for any money. Whether I sell or not is never a question in my mind. And that's why when you guys are putting your soul like that into your art, I swear to you, as a practicing artist, I understand, I relate. And I just hope that this language of art that has been sometimes trivialized and you know, I keep forgetting, like Lara said, you know, you're hot, you're a woman, you're Arab, you're gay, you're this, you're that. No, I feel so who doesn't deal and relate to this? What she is sharing, what you guys are sharing is so universal. I genuinely believe it transcends Arab and gay and artists. That's why I wanted to speak. So I'm gonna stop. I'm talking too much.
Thank you so much, Shauki. That was beautiful. Thank you for sharing.
That was beautiful. I would like to be mindful of everyone's time. I think Abby has been kind enough to remind me that we're way over time, and our panelists, we've kept you long enough. Thank you so much. And I'm just turning to closing remarks, and I'm gonna say a couple words, then I'm gonna ask our panelists to say a couple words. Thank you guys so much. This has been an incredible discussion. Clearly, we need more of this. We need more space to discuss this. There are a lot more questions to be answered. And I think this was phenomenal. I will try my best to put together another group, maybe another time for all of us to chat. And our panelists, please, if you have any closing remarks, and we'll end up with Abby, who will close us down.
I only want to express my thanks and gratitude, not only for the organizers of bringing us together, but for all of you attending here today. I think that we lose sight of how impactful these discussions can be, especially when we can be in a place where we feel safe to really open up and discuss a lot of these themes, and doing the work that we do that is so often it's so often hard to find that venue. So I'm really grateful that we're able to all come together today, and thank you.
I agree. Thank you all so much for making me feel seen, making me feel heard, for giving me your thoughts and your energy that will get me through what's been kind of a weird season. It's very nice to feel not alone, you know, and jog parts of my brain that I have maybe tucked away for too long. So I appreciate you all, and it's been lovely.
Same here. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for Stephen, Ren, Apex Art, everybody who is creating spaces such as this, right? It's so meaningful, and it's so, there's a mission to the organization, right? And this mission has been so successful, and this is a perfect example of that. And I really am thankful to be part of the exhibition, to be part of a space that allows us or give us a chance, opportunity, not only to connect, but to express ourselves the way that we just did in this past hour and a half. So my love to you all, and be safe out there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Yes, and one final thing, the show is up for one more week. It closes next Saturday. If you find yourself in New York City, go down to Apex Art, see the show. If it not, go online to Apex Art and take a look, take a tour around the show. And thank you, everyone. Abby, I turn it to you to close us down.
Wonderful. Only just to add my own thank yous for being here and spending this time. It was a difficult panel to time keep because I feel like we could have kept going and going. But this is kind of our chance where we get to invite everyone who is here with us on Zoom to unmute and say your thank you, say what you would like, and we kind of get to end in lots of wonderful noise. But thank you all for being here, and just take care.
Thank you.
So yes, everyone can unmute as they exit if you would like to add your voice. If not, we will see you soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. It was great.
Thank you.